Hi everyone, my name is Johanna Ogum. In this presentation, I will speak about asset-based community development evaluation and development evaluation. Thank you for your attention. I would like to go through the background of these evaluation methods. The asset-based community development (ABCD) is an evaluation method traced back to Jody Crestman and John McKnight. Both of these are researchers from Northwestern University Institute for Policy Research. They had decades and decades of research and community work all over the United States, and as a result, at the end of a couple of decades, they came up with the evaluation method known as asset-based community development (ABCD). They found it very useful to undertake community development evaluation. And the second evaluation, developmental evaluation rather, DE, is traced back to Michael Quinn Patton. Michael Quinn Patton is an independent consultant based in Minnesota, United States. We have had our guest speaker previously, the daughter of Michael Quinn Patton. She introduced to us various evaluation methods, utilization-based, blue marble evaluation, and so on. So he was a former president of the American Evaluation Association. He has authored 8 major evaluation methods books, including utilization-focused evaluation that we discussed in the guest speaker series, and the qualitative research and evaluation methods used in over 500 universities worldwide. As the name implies, I want to go straight to the evaluation methods to describe them. First of all, I will describe asset-based community development, and then go ahead and describe the developmental evaluation. As the name implies, the asset-based community development, in shorter form ABCD, is a type of evaluation strategy that's based on the premise that communities can in fact drive the development by identifying and mobilizing existing but often unrecognized assets. So the ABCD approach recognizes the importance of assets and the potential of assets and people and social capital and network within the community as an asset that can in fact drive change to solve problems that confront the community. Hence, it's very important to understand this process and evaluation as an evaluation model. Therefore, one will say that the asset-based community development is a community-driven development approach that's based on local development, community themselves, in a process of asking, discussing, defining a common process or interest, and achieving by way of mobilizing local resources and talents. We all know that even in sometimes marginalized communities or settings, there is talent. Even in difficult circumstances like war, for example, poverty, there are talented people. In fact, almost everyone is gifted. We can say each one of us has a particular gift, talent, something valuable to offer. This is the cornerstone of this evaluation method. Hence, as far as problems exist, there are indeed multiple opportunities lacking within the community. There is therefore a process of inward looking, or I should say internal examination or evaluation, to find solutions using local assets to solve local needs. Therefore, it's a people's-led process, a community-driven process, which is grounded in a framework of society, collaboration, collective action, collective process, consensus building. On the other hand, developmental evaluation, DE, is an evaluational method which is quite contrary to the traditional evaluation methods we are used to. It is an evaluation method that does not have context or a methodological context or a specific guideline or a strict rules followed by traditional evaluation methods, and therefore it's a sort of a dynamic evaluation method that is based on the context, the environment, especially complex environments, dynamic environments, unreliable environments, and difficult situations, difficult complex environments. So therefore, this evaluation method is a fast changing, is an evaluation method that is applied in an environment in which situations or circumstances change, are dynamic, and therefore does not need specific or predetermined goals or objectives, and therefore it has always a tendency to in real time make changes, adapt, be responsive, be sensitive to the local context, change as fast as it can by depending on feedback loops with stakeholders and so forth. As I said earlier, this evaluation method called ABCD views people within the community not as a burden, but as assets ready to be tapped. It's a major shift, especially in the way our societies are organized today. People, especially poor people, feel so much isolated from themselves and from their own communities, and always feel that help always should come from outside, quote, the outside, end of quote. The developmental evaluation, on the other hand, which is similar to ABCD method, looks at the evaluation internally. So, as I said earlier, developmental evaluation does not seek evaluation to be done by an external party, or rather works in a dynamic environment in which, for this case, developmental evaluation, for example, applied to a developmental agency or a developmental organization, an NGO, for example, and this NGO has program staff. This evaluation method is primarily driven by the people themselves, working within the organization, the program staff, program officers, and therefore they are the one creating this massive system change process in which feedbacks flow from stakeholders to the program staff and so on and so forth in real time, and therefore they do not need an external evaluator or an external person to come to do evaluation. They just do it in a form of an evaluation feedback loop process, whereby the whole kind of system, the stakeholders themselves, the organization, are engaged in an evaluation process in real time, in a very dynamic process, without need of looking upon a predetermined SMART principle or a very strict linear SMART methodology, evaluation methodology, but rather in a very dynamic way, depend on participate in evaluation process by depending on evaluation feedback loops from key stakeholders and so on and so forth. Similar to the ABCD approach, ABCD approach views people within the community themselves as primary drivers of this evaluation, in which that particular evaluation method does not rely on an external evaluator coming to do the evaluation within the community, but the community members themselves drive the evaluation, and they participate in the evaluation process, and they do the evaluation by bringing upon resources which are available in the community and do not necessarily rely on someone else or an external solution to come up. Going on, the ABCD builds on the assets that are already found in the community. It mobilizes individuals, associations, and institutions to come together to build on their assets, not concentrate on their needs. An extensive period is spent identifying the assets of individuals, associations, and then institutions before they are mobilized to work together to build on the identified assets of all those involved. Then the identified assets of an individual are matched with people or groups who have an interest or need in that asset. The key is to begin to use what's already within the community. ABCD approach builds on this idea that the key to development is to use what's already in the community, the assets in the community, the assets that are already available in the community, and mobilize them. Assets I refer in this case to associations, individuals, networks, social capital, land, physical land, social connections, organized community groups, common interests, All these are brought together to kind of build something good and positive for the community. In other words, the community identifies assets, involves everyone, mobilizes to work together in a united fashion to match assets with people or groups within the society that most need them. It's fascinating to think about it. So, to conclude this slide, the ABCD approach relies on the asset of these people, the individual as an asset, the membership or groups of volunteer organizations this individual belongs to as an asset, institutions, and so on and so forth. It does not rely on an external evaluator, as I said earlier. For the developmental evaluation approach, likewise, does not rely on an external evaluator. It does not need to care about the principle of just strict principle of the traditional principle of accountability on independent, getting an independent evaluator from external source, or getting an external evaluator for the sake of objectivity. It does not really mean that this evaluation method is less objective or less accountable, but they harness assets within their own systems. So for the case of developmental evaluation, it harnesses assets within the development organization, development agency, development NGO, for example, to use feedback loops within the systems, structures within the development organization to relay these feedbacks with stakeholders and themselves in order to create real-time solutions, real-time progress in their intervention. And they don't need to stick to a very strict methodological plan or methodological procedure or criteria, for example. Again, the guiding principles of asset-based community development are that the individual community has potential within itself. There is capacity and potential that can be found within the community. Much of this capacity, however, is not often utilized at all or utilized to the maximum. Yes, the community has problems. Yes, there are social problems. Yes, there are economic problems as well, and whatnot. Okay, but again, as this strategy implies, there are assets within the community that, if tapped, mobilized, effectively matched, can be helpful to reach need points within the community. And that's the very important. Everyone has an asset, a gift, a talent. No one is to be ignored. Everyone has something to offer. Think of it. It's like a marionette or an interconnected system where each of the dots has a role to play, and it's necessary to motivate each of the actors to provide their best performance, skill, and assets, identify them, and match them to those who need them. The developmental evaluation, rather, on the other hand, it's an evaluation method that is also driven by the people themselves within the organization, driven internally with the program staff, for example, and the stakeholders in which the intervention is being conducted. Therefore, this implies that the structure of evaluation is based on a system in which there is a feedback loop between the program staff, for example, and the stakeholders, beneficiaries, stakeholders. Therefore, this feedback loop is the cornerstone of this evaluation, whereby solutions are made in real time. Therefore, there is progress. It's not kind of a summative evaluation, but this is an evaluation method which relies mostly on improving on what's already existing, improving on knowledge, best practices that's already existing, to improve on it, to make a further progress and further change. Therefore, it supports development, it supports innovation, it supports adaptation, it supports functioning in a very dynamic environment, the complex environment. So this evaluation method is sensitive to the context, sensitive to the environment, sensitive to the dynamic environment, and therefore always goes through an evaluation method which is goes through with a innovative mindset, to be able to be creative, to adapt, to change to whatever is unfolding before it. So it's a very flexible development approach, which is adaptable, open, agile, rigorous, based on evidence on the ground. Therefore, it has similarities to the ABCD approach, but it has also a major differences. In other words, in the ABCD approach, everyone has a gift. Relationships in the community are valuable and important. Listening and conversing among community members, stakeholders within the community is important. The fundamental premise is of all of it is that, as I said earlier, people do care. People do care about something, even if very little or too little. But there's something that they care about. Okay, and that's what the conversation is all about. The community should be centered on that conversation, be focused, and try to arouse motivation, the natural motivation that exists within the community. One other way is by asking questions, providing questions instead of answers. We're all entitled in this type of notion that answers are to be found in a government office somewhere, and questions are only to be found within the community. The ABCD strategy fundamentally changes this whole paradigm. Communities members themselves feel confident that answers are to be found within the community itself, in the assets of their people, in the connections, in their networks, the networks of their people, and not necessarily from an outside force or the government, for example. To build on this core positive future, the ABCD approach focuses on the positive capacity of individuals and community assets rather than just worrying about negatives, the problems, the needs, the deficits, etc. So the ABCD approach is quite rather different from the developmental evaluation, because the ABCD approach is more positive, relies on positive assets within the community. But developmental evaluation operates in a very dynamic, complex, sometimes very difficult, uncertain, and reliable environments. Something else I need to note is that the fundamental premise of both ABCD approach and the developmental evaluation is that they do not really need an external evaluator to come to do evaluation themselves or to solve certain problems within their intervention. They depend on internally on assets within themselves. For the ABCD approach, it's community driven, depends on community resources themselves, individuals and networks within the community. For the developmental evaluation, it depends on the systems formed within the organization itself, whether it is the feedback loops and sharing of knowledge, best practices within the organization itself, program and staff themselves, and including engaging the stakeholders. So it's an internal process that does not rely necessarily on a sort of quote objective, independent, external evaluator. So therefore, the developmental evaluation method is rather dynamic, does not really need to stick to a predetermined goals or objectives, and so on and so forth. Yeah, in this slide, I will consider to present about strengths and limitations of both evaluation methods. Now, here is what is the challenge. For example, for the ABCD approach, the downsides to it is that it's based on identifying assets and capacity in the community, mobilizing and matching them to points in the community that most need it. If you think about it, all the tedious work involved that goes into it, it's mind-boggling. Therefore, the ABCD approach is said to be time-consuming and sometimes very, very costly. So to apply it compared to other evaluation methods, it's quite very costly. For the developmental approach, rather, not necessarily about the cost of doing that evaluation. It's dependent on context, for example. So if you need to be driven by complexity awareness of complexity on the ground, because it's the constant of the developmental approach is it's flexible. It does not like traditional evaluation. It does not look to consider a methodological or a specific predetermined evaluation methodology, but it's very flexible. It's dynamic itself. It looks upon dynamic environments. It works inside dynamic and difficult environments, complex environments rather, to be able to create change, create improvements. Therefore, it's always seeks to address environments which are very complex, difficult to operate. And therefore, sometimes there are a lot of difficulties that come with it. For example, you need to be context sensitive. So sometimes the approach, the developmental approach, might not be sensitive to the context of a long period of time. For example, USAID, for instance, working in a complex environment, in a refugee setup, for example, or in a different complex environment, just because they are relying on developmental approach. For example, they have done this approach for quite a while. They might have tendency to rely on certain strict best practices that they have done in the past without an intent to change or to be agile, adaptable. So they might stick to a certain methodological formula or a evaluation methodology that they had been using in the past, which has been successful in the past. And therefore, that can be a challenge because this particular evaluation method, developmental evaluation, strictly determines that evaluation should not rely on a strict formula. It should always be open-minded, be flexible, be agile, be open to change, be dynamic. For the ABCD approach, it is asset-centric approach. In simplest terms, this approach, the asset-based strategy, is overly focused on strengths and capabilities of the communities, I should say, and not what needs or shortcomings are found to be in the community. Therefore, there is a danger of over-focusing on strengths, over-emphasis on strengths and assets, and thereby duplicating something that's appraised within the community. So, again, it's very difficult to identify the value of the asset, to match them with points of needs within the community, and overall, this approach is mostly centered on or is applicable to tangible assets within the community. The question is, what's a tangible asset? Or what makes an asset to be tangible? Or what makes an asset tangible? This is my final slide. I will discuss about assets in both evaluation methods and make a brief summary. In this slide, I will look at what assets are analyzed and are evaluated in the ABCD approach, and as well as the developmental evaluation approach. Well, what assets and capabilities are to be found within the ABCD approach, for example. The assets and capabilities are viewed in ABCD as potentially useful to find and identify within the context of a community or are to be found within the community itself. Of course, most of these assets I've already discussed in the earlier slides. Let me just highlight some of them. The first one is individual. At the heart of the ABCD approach is the asset called the individual. The individual has gifts and talents that must be acknowledged, valued, and identified. Think about it for a second. An individual can themselves be needy or have a need, but instead of focusing on their need per se so much, this approach looks closely to identify their potential as well, their capacity, their gifts, their talent, their uniqueness, their capabilities, and match that to someone else in the community that most needs it. The other asset is, of course, the associations. Of course, beyond an individual is associations or commons, the groups that these individuals belong to. So individual can be an asset, and therefore these individuals themselves are members of association within the community. They are perhaps members of a voluntary organization within the community. So these are very important strategic assets determined in the ABCD approach. The idea of the mini community, for example, in which clubs, for example, group clubs within the community, each with a specific but common interest. This approach views all this as an asset. It's not necessarily to deal with the individual only, but the whole group. They already have common interests and share common values and norms. In simple terms, a community. It's therefore easier to do mobilization in this type of setting. Of course, these associations are structured or organized around some sort of strict rules and regulations, but these groups are made up of participants, willing participants. So the association is by consensus. Look at what is being mentioned, consensus. So members within the community are participating in an open, democratic, consensus-like process in which they themselves own the process, and therefore there is no particular strict structure. Perhaps I will draw your attention to the developmental evolution approach as well. The developmental approach, as relates to this point I just made, defines itself. It does not really have a strict structure. In other words, it does not regulate itself. It does not regulate its with a certain outcome based or a impact based or goal based. It does not have a predetermined goal sets or objectives, or it does not have a predetermined for example, does not follow a smart process or a smart principle or a smart evolution methodology. It therefore has only relies on feedback assets within the community, within the evaluation organization and the stakeholders involved in the intervention program. And therefore, that's a very key important point to make. So it's not structured. It's unstructured rather. It's very flexible. The key here is flexibility, dynamic, agile, open-minded, open and willing to change. So therefore, even though there are certain goals, at least more broadly speaking, but these goals can change quickly with time. So it's not strict, it's not very hard or fixed, or it's not something that cannot be changed. So it's very flexible. So they change with time. They flow with the process. And so therefore, and they flow with the context of the environment in which the intervention is being done. Conversely, in the ABCD approach, structured groups within the community exist. Exist as are referred to as institutions. Okay, they are based on structured agreements, requirements, concessions, norms, and rules, but in a sort of a structured way. These forms of structured associations are themselves assets the community can leverage on. An example is the Whittier Community-Based Policing Project in Minneapolis, United States, where, for example, police department as an institution within the society find it's being used as an asset, and the community members from the Whittier low-income neighborhood pull these local resources as assets in order to find solutions to crime within the society, within the community. So this is a local utilization of this particular evaluation method in a low-income neighborhood community in Minneapolis, in which community members see themselves as assets instead of seeing themselves as liabilities. And they also see the police department as an institutional asset in which they can leverage and use it to bring solutions to crime in the community. The other, of course, is the physical assets. The physical resources found within the geographical territory in which the community finds itself. This can be land, etc. If the community can, for example, lease or rent out an idle portion of their land for an economic activity, it's a way of using an asset to meet the need. Finally, another major asset for ABCD approach is the connections and social capital that exists within the community. These are connections, trust, and a sense of community built over time, and therefore can be a very helpful asset. The social relationships, networks, trust form the social capital of a society, of a community. So the networks and the trust form the social capital of a community. This approach acknowledges the potential of these assets to drive development and change. We can think of family networks, for example, peers within community. For example, our family members, family networks. These family networks have peers themselves, etc. All these are assets, viewed as assets in the ABCD approach. In the developmental evaluation approach, this evaluation approach works in a kind of a system in which the evaluation is being done, for example, let's say by name an organization, USAID. It's a development aid organization run by its department. For example, it works in a hostile environment or a complex environment in Syria, for example. Therefore, the environment cannot be said to be very reliable. It's a complex environment, very unreliable environment, difficult, complex to operate, and therefore the developmental evaluation is an evaluation method that in such kind of an environment, complex environment, works to address change in development by being responsive to the needs of the context of the environment, for instance. So it's very responsive and it's so adaptable. It does this by leveraging on feedback loops from this community stakeholders, from the stakeholders in which the intervention program is being done and the program staff themselves. And therefore, this feedback loops manages information, best practices, knowledge, information is being passed within this system approach internally. So there's an internal team of the organization, for example, USAID. So it functions in an integrated process of gathering information, interpreting data, developing measures, outcomes as they emerge. So it's very dynamic. It's open to change. So measures change during the evaluation process. So measures do not remain the same. So evaluation questions, evaluation assets, evaluation measures are not definite. They change. So this particular evaluation method does not follow methodological script. Rather, it's methodologically flexible. It's adaptable. It's open. It's agile. It depends on teamwork. It's a rigorous process that depends on evidence-based perspectives, feedback loops that enable evaluation process to be adaptable in a particularly harsh or rather complex and difficult environments. This is my research resource. Okay, thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you had learned something or two, perhaps about the asset-based approach. I hope one day, as an evaluation expert in a marginalized community, you might be able to apply it. That marks the end of my presentation. Thank you.